Welcome to Revolution Against Evolution. I'm your host, Doug Sharp.
I'm your co-host, Rich Gear, and Darwin is on the menu today, right, Doug?
Yeah, I was preparing for the show tonight, and this was going to be a different topic tonight.
Right, we have a guest who actually turned out, got sick, you know?
Yeah, she's going to be on our show next week, but I was preparing for that, and her show is going to be on the Galapagos Islands. So
I was really looking forward to that, but that's okay. We will do that next week, Lord willing, and she doesn't get sick again or something else happens. But anyway, this subject, Doug, Darwin, you talk about the issues that he has with his own theory.
Right, and I was looking into the Origin of Species, and this is Ray Comfort's edition of the Origin of Species, the 150th anniversary edition. And what he did was he's got a foreword in this book that talks about Darwin and his theory and everything like that, and explains it from a creationist standpoint. And so it's sort of a thumb in your face type of
yeah, but to his credit though, Comfort puts, well, it's a little bit of an abridged version. Doesn't put a lot of the geology that he had in the original edition, but he's got pretty much all of his theory. It's out there to read it, in context. It's not making quotes and people can accuse people taking it out of context. He actually puts the whole book, the Origin of Species, there, but he has some notes on it. So yeah.
And so I was looking through this specifically to see if there's I could find what I was talking about, specifically the Darwin's finches on the Galapagos Islands.
Oh yeah. Okay.
And what I instead found was this chapter that he wrote, Difficulties on Theory, which
that's actually a good chapter. Yeah.
And it's chapter 6 in the Origin of Species. So. The thing that I found was interesting was that he, it's a logical thing. If you have somebody who is hostile to your whole sense of ideas, actually reluctantly agree with you on certain things,
it gives it a little more weight.
It gives it a little bit more weight, and so. Here are some of the difficulties that Darwin had with his own theory, and he thought that he might have had some answers, but it turns out that
the answers he had
weren't very good. And so here's what he said. Here's the first one. He says, firstly, why, if species have descended from other species, by insensibly fine gradations, do we not everywhere seen innumerable transitional forms? Why is not all nature in confusion instead of the species being, as we see them, well defined?
Yeah, so what is his answer that he gives for it?
Well, he says that the fossil record is incomplete.
Right, and this was 1859 when he came up with this, right. And we've had.
He said, and his hope was that as the people did more exploration, they would find more transitional forms and species, and it would corroborate his theory. Well, it
has done anything but. Let's put it. Let's give away the answer. In over 150 years of since his theory, they've excavated and. In no small part have done a lot of excavation for the purpose of do just what Darwin thought should happen, try to find the missing links. I'm growing up, you heard about the missing links all the time. Now, granted, a lot of people think about that in terms of the missing fossil between human beings and apes, right, or whatever, or ape-like hominids. But missing links are in all branches of the body. They're just everywhere. And we pointed that out numerous times on the show, Doug. You have all this wonderful looking fossil tree. Of course, now who's the guy? Who's the guy? Lubenow. I get the two L's, guys. One guy's a creationist, one guy's an evolutionist. But Lubenow says it's more like a lot of bushes now, rather than one little fossil tree. And the reason why is because the more you keep discover, you keep finding more missing links. And you keep finding but even with the fossil tree, when they had this nice little theory, you had all this stuff at the ends, and then all these missing stuff that quote supposedly led to them because they don't have it and they've never found it.
And so what you have with the things that you don't have evidence for, you have wishful thinking. You have
just so stories they make up. They may, as they call them, just kind of ad hoc explanations for why they're not there or what the thing should look like. For instance, the missing link between the reptile and, or if you will, the dinosaur and the bird.
Right.
As things started with, they jumped into the tree, but there's no partial bird dinosaur thing there or reptile thing, as much as they try to make morphological similarity, by claws and things of that nature. But it just doesn't.
That segues back into Darwin's next point.
Go ahead. That was good. So what's his next point?
His next point is, secondly, is it possible that an animal having, for instance, the structure and habits of a bat, it could have been formed by modification of some animal with wholly different habits? Can we believe that natural selection could produce, on one hand, organs of trifling importance, such as the tail of a giraffe, which serves as a fly flapper, and on the other hand, organs of such wonderful structure as an eye, which we hardly as yet fully understand the inimitable perfection?
Yeah, it's interesting because, when Darwin was around, the idea of the living cell is about as complicated as sort of like a sort of a soft marble or blob of jelly or something. They didn't really understand it like we do today. It's infinitely more complex, the things we know today about it, than what Darwin in his day. So I can forgive him a little. I mean, even though I know he had an agenda, and he even knew his agenda was really anti-God and anti-Christian, if you will. And he was, and he uses the term species, which is sort of unfortunate for us because we as Christians, as creationists, don't have really that many problems with natural selection being a mechanism to work. The environment can work on genetics. We know that it does that. But what we find out is, as opposed to creating something brand new, like he's proposing here, it basically shifts things around and turns on something that was already in the living organism, or somehow it deletes it, causing things to look differently or functional. Like, for instance, the finches on the Galapagos, on the islands, where they have the long beaks and short beaks. And it's interesting that the rock finches, when they come back and they let them breed where they don't have some of these environmental things, oftentimes they revert back to the standard finch. It's not even a permanent thing necessarily.
Now, here's what I found out that's very interesting is that Darwin actually misidentified them as finches. They're actually tanagers.
Okay. That sounds like the hyrax and the rock badger, thing with the Eohippus. Remember that, But anyway, go ahead.
But anyway, I kind of like, when we were talking about the missing links, there was one evolutionist that said, I hate the term missing link because each time we discover a new species, we create two more.
And that's sort of been the pattern,
What you
over the
do is
150
create another problem evolutionists can't solve because they then have to figure out, well, how did it transition from this species to this other species? Of course, we've always had this little thing of forks evolving from spoons.
Yeah,
we would line up their silverware in a little sequence.
You got a spork in the middle,
We'd be able to show that there's a progressive sequence between different things, showing a relationship of that some sort.
Right.
But what we're really viewing with all the different species, and this is what Darwin observed, is that there are common features and functions that is common in all of life, and they do different things, but it's all the same bottom line structure. And what it speaks of is a common creator, a common designer.
I was going to say,
not a common ancestor.
And that's the difference between approaches. Do we have all this diversity and all this complexity and all this variety of living organisms because of that all came from a common ancestor, as Darwin is proposing, or we could have a common designer that realized, okay, I've got oxygen. Every living creature is going to need to have the mechanism in some form or another, a lung to basically breathe oxygen. Of course, he then throws a little monkey wrench in there from time to time. I love those little things down at the bottom of the sea, those air vents, those creatures that live under the sulfur things down there. There's something that doesn't quite do that, and they have something different, but they can't even propose where that would have come from, some common ancestor. But the point of it is a common designer as opposed to a common ancestor being used for common purposes makes sense that you have similarities of organs and a morphological and even on cellular level you have similarities for certain things that have happened.
It's like the design of flight, you know.
Yep.
We have bats, birds, insects, and flying reptiles, and you have 4 different kinds of designs, but it's the same designer that incorporated those in 4 different ways.
Right, and that we talked that in our other show we just did about flight. The idea that you could have 4 different kinds of flight evolving 4 separate ways, because in the genome, Doug, in the genetic thing, they're absolutely different, as I understand it, different reasons why they exist. In other words, they're not an insect wing didn't turn into a reptile wing.
Right.
A reptile wing didn't turn into a mammal wing, and then into a bird. It just didn't happen that way. They're absolutely different ways they started, because you have the same need for flight for different things. Like the insect has a small body, so certain things can be used for that. And what gets me is how often, and Darwin did this as well. They anthropomorphize nature, and if you want, natural selection almost has a creative power in and of itself, as though it's working on nature to create things. But at the same time, they want their cake and eat it too, Doug. They say, well, it's random chance. There's no intelligence behind any of it. They say that on the one hand, yet everything they do seems to smack of. Because everything inside of us, Doug, knows this thing, you know, what's the old expression? If it looks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it's probably a duck. If it looks like design and acts like design, it's probably been designed. You know, the idea of the blind watchmaker, so to speak. You know, the idea that if you have a watch, you know, the blind watchmaker was trying to say it just happened by blind chance, but a blind watchmaker never would make a watch. It couldn't do it. And what would be the purpose of it, Doug? Why would you want to make a watch? Like I said, it was Braille. You know what I mean? But I mean, why would you want to have a watch that you had to look at if you're blind? It makes no sense at all.
Yeah, if it looks like a Doug and quacks like a Doug.
Yeah, that's you. Then it's you. Okay, all right,
that's
Doug.
Me.
All right. So what's another point, Doug?
Okay, he's just giving a serving up.
He's giving away
wonderful,
for the farm, isn't he?
Yeah, he's serving up slow softballs to Miguel Cabrera. You know?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Thirdly, can instincts be acquired and modified through natural selection? What shall we say to so marvelous of an instinct that leads the bee to make cells, which have practically anticipated the discoveries of profound mathematicians? And so
That's amazing. That's quite an insight that he would realize back in the beginning there, you know?
Yeah. The bumblebees, and there's just thousands of different examples of things of that sort where you have instinct, inbred intelligence.
Sure, the homing instinct of the monarch butterfly. They don't last very, you know, they last one season before they turn into this caterpillar and they go into the chrysalis and come out, and they have these patterns. They fly to South America and then they come back. I mean, that's amazing how they know to do that.
Yeah, that's really,
you know, that's just one thing. I mean, there's a lot of stuff like that, of course, but instincts, okay. Anything else, Doug?
Yeah. Fourthly, how can we account for species when crossed being sterile and producing sterile offspring? Whereas when varieties are crossed, the fertilities are unimpaired. And so what he's saying is that the species can't cross and interbreed.
No.
And so he's seeing that as an issue. And so, you know, those are 4 of the difficulties that he has. There is one here. Here's what he said about organs of extreme perfection and complication. To suppose that the eye, with all its inimitable contrivances for adjusting the focus to different distances, for emitting different amounts of light and for the correction of spherical and chromatic aberration could have been formed by natural selection seems, I freely confess, absurd to the highest possible degree.
I mean, and guess what? It is absurd to the highest possible degree. I mean, again, I would that's what's interesting, Doug, is everything Darwin is dealing with shows these problems on gross morphological things. He hasn't even gotten into how complex the cell is.
No, he hasn't.
We've done some shows with Jerry Bergman. He gets into some of the cellular stuff. Doug's gotten into it too, the microbiological stuff.
Let's see what he has to say
stuff,
further about the eye. He says, yet reason tells me that if numerous gradations from a perfect and complex eye to one very perfect and imperfect and simple, each grade being useful to its possessor, can be shown to exist, if further the eye does vary ever so slightly and the variations can be inherited, which is certainly the case, and if any variation or modification in the organ ever be useful to an animal under changing conditions of life, then the difficulty of believing that a perfect and complex eye can be formed by natural selection, though insuperable by our imagination, can hardly be considered real.
Well, see, what you're saying is from maybe a photosensitive light cell, it could evolve into the complex eye as we know it today, right?
Right, and so he's how a nerve can become sensitive to light hardly concerns us more than how life itself first originated.
And there you go, too, Doug. This is what I tell people, too. The Darwinian explanation of things, even the neo-Darwinian explanation, does not explain how something that's non-living becomes living.
Right.
I mean, Doug, that's an insurmountable thing. And you know, creationists often get accused of being stupid because they say, well, you know, evolution's only a theory. And of course the scientist says, oh, you moron. When we mean by theory, we mean it's so obviously, you know, obviously you can't prove everything, but it's so obviously, it's been proved by so many different things that it's basically a fact. I said, no, then it'd be called a law. For instance, the law of abiogenesis, Doug, where life always comes from life. Life will never come from non-life. And that's exactly what Darwin contradicts. The Darwinian theory has to have, and when you do that, they'll bait and switch you and say, well, no, evolution has to do with increasing complexity among things that are already alive. I beg to differ. They only tell you that when you catch them, okay? Right. They only say that when you catch them in that. But if you don't catch them in that, they will deal with cosmological evolution. They will deal with non-living things coming to spontaneous generation, which is what they would. Evolution demands spontaneous generation, which has never been observed in science. Okay? Evolution demands something to go from simplicity to complexity by adding new genetic information, which is, again, has never been seen in science. It has never been observed. So tell me, who's the most religious here?
Right.
And Darwin had a religious thing here, or if you will, an anti-religious bent.
Right.
Basically, we talked about this as his own life. Well, number one, his grandfather was pretty much an evolutionist, Erasmus Darwin, and he was raised in sort of a Unitarian or kind of I would call it not a very strong Christian background idea, even though they said he was training to be a minister when he was younger. But the fact is, when his daughter died, I think he basically rejected God in his entirety. And this theory that he comes up with, as gracious as Darwin tried to be in his writing, in this one, Descent of Man, he's not so nice. He's a little bit more overt. In fact, a lot more overt. Yeah. That's what he's kind of put in this pod, because he knows that if you accept this theory, you're basically throwing design and intelligence outside of humanity. You're throwing it out. You have to tell me that properties that are inherent in matter make something non-living become alive and something simple become complex, which is antithetical to everything in science that we know.
Now, it's interesting that you can read Darwin's work here in this particular chapter, and you can watch him as he's contemplating these different questions, do a whole lot of hand-waving and sort of glossing over the problem.
Which we have to do, because these problems are real.
And when you get down to it, you can then, as you're reading this chapter, ask the question, has science actually come up with any more solid evidence than what he had at that time.
By the way, that's another thing that the science has done over the years, and it's actually benefited the creationists. A lot of their theories have actually become creationist friends. But Doug, they do two things. Doug, they move you out to outer space, or they move you down to inner space so far that you can't. They try to get away from things that can be observed.
Right.
That's what they've done. This is a speculative piece of fiction. They actually had some semblance of plot. You know what it reminds me of? It reminds me of socialism before we realize how bad of a political system that really is.
No, socialism was derived from this.
Yeah, well, we know that too, but I'm saying that, yeah, but when people promoted it back in the 1920s and 30s, Doug, I kind of, or even in the teens, if you will, I give them, even though the idea sounded wrong to start with, we didn't know until they did it, started putting it in, you realize, oh my gosh, it's bankrupted. In our country's bankrupted about every city we have. Every country, every city that's run by socialistic principles has bankrupted the cities, but it's bankrupted the Soviet Union, it's bankrupt. Even China had to basically go into capitalism to make itself work, and it's doing well. That's on that aspect of it. Darwin does the same thing, Doug. When they first started, I'll give them a little bit of grace because even though he had an agenda, an anti-God agenda, still you didn't know, and the complexity of the cell was not known. Even now, we don't know fully how complicated it is, but we know so much more than we did back in his day.
We're starting to sort out junk DNA.
It's not junk.
Yeah. So-called junk DNA.
Yeah, so-called junk. That's, again, it's an evolutionary concept like vestigial organs, Doug. All these terms that evolution has come up with have been discarded because they've shown to be fallacious terms. They've been shown to be false and inaccurate and just flat out wrong. That's what we could, and when you think that what's the definition of insanity?
You keep doing the same thing,
expecting a different result, and that's what evolution does. They keep doing the same thing, expecting a different result, and that's the dilemma we're left in because people know that without evolution, you basically have to go into a theistic explanation of life. Then you're going to have to argue the different religions, okay? But the point of it is, these people do not want a theistic explanation. Okay, they do not.
No, I don't think that Darwin attempted very much to address spontaneous generation.
No, he avoided it.
Yeah, he talked a little bit about the warm little pond someplace.
Yeah, primordial ooze.
Yeah,
the pond scum.
Now, when we go down to the Creation Museum, I'm going to ask them if they serve primordial soup.
Yeah, primordial soup. Yeah,
and chocolate chip cookies.
But see, these are things that, Doug. It begs the question when you have a theory like this. You have to go to the origin. Ultimately, you're stuck with the uncaused first cause. Doug, I tell people who talk about the origin of the missing link between man. You and I, we talked about the Sterkfontein caves we've been to, the evolution of man, the issues. How complicated it is to go from a chimpanzee to a thing, and I've been amazed at how they try to say how similar a rhesus monkey or an orangutan or whatever it is to human beings are, yet they want to show how different Neanderthal is from human beings. It's like depending on which face they want to put on, they will make one really different. Even though it's unarguable that Neanderthal is much closer to us, in fact, it is us, as opposed to a rhesus monkey.
The recent study now shows that Neanderthals are like 99.7% similar to our genetics.
Yeah.
But the question, I guess, is how did they know what that original Neanderthal genetics looked like?
Exactly.
Unless you had extracted somebody way back then, extracted a sample and but preserved it faithfully.
Well, are they getting DNA out of the Neanderthal skeleton? Are they getting some of that? I mean, because if they're fossils, you can't get any DNA; it'd be gone.
Right.
And if it's 1 million years old, but I tell people something else. Look, I said, look, we believe you're ultimately stuck with the uncaused first cause. And Doug, here's the deal. But suppose we get all the way down and we let all the uncaused first causes, and you get to human beings. All right, Doug, and somehow you not only get one, but two ape-like hominids turning into human beings. And they turn, oh my gosh, fortuitously, into one man and one woman.
Right.
You're 500,000 years old when this happens, or maybe 100,000, whatever term you want to get. Why are we not all genetically retarded or extinct 300 times over? We know what happens when you inbreed too much, right, Doug?
Right, yeah.
We know what happens. You get retards, you get hemophiliacs, you get genetic defects.
And that's the opposite of what evolution would have you.
Would have you believe, but we know what we see. Now you say to me, well, you believe in one man and one woman. But the difference is we have the uncaused first cause causing human beings into existence with a perfection of the genome in the beginning. We see how that breaks down in the biblical record, and that lifespans decrease, and close personal marriage between brother and sister, that becomes forbidden during the time of Moses, but earlier on that was not forbidden. Even the time of Abraham, he got a bride, it was a close personal relative for Isaac. It was not forbidden. My point, I didn't want to go too much in a segue there, but I'm saying we have something outside of us that makes things happen. Darwin has to appeal to properties inherent in matter, and it doesn't work.
Yeah, you remember the old cartoon where you had an ape sitting on the chair, and he had the Darwin's Origin of Species in one hand and the Bible in another hand, and somebody asked him, well, what are you doing? He says, well, I'm trying to figure out if I'm my brother's keeper or my keeper's brother.
That's pretty good. That's not bad.
So, since I have I would say that if you're an intellectual, read the Darwin's Origin of Species. Get a hold of a copy of Ray Comfort's version here with his introduction, so that you can compare the creationist interpretation of what Darwin says with. But if you read it straight out of the box with just sort of an uncritical mind, taking it to the illogical conclusions that he makes, you can see that it doesn't. It didn't hold water when he first wrote it.
What holds water, Doug? Even if I think Comfort matches this, when he deals with things that he empirically verified,
right.
Variation within fixed kinds, he's very good. It's just when you extrapolate beyond that, which is what the evolutionist wants to do. They want to show you variation, and then they want to take it out to this other thing. That's when it falls apart.
See you next time on Revolution Against Evolution.